Sup folks, this is Dan from Discern, and these are my thoughts on the new album from the Brilliance, All Is Not Lost. The Brilliance is the New York-based duo of David Gungor, the brother of Michael Gungor, sort of similar to him in style and thought, and John Arndt, an exquisitely talented classical musician and songwriter/composer. The group released their self-titled debut album in 2010, followed by a good number of EPs over the next 5 years. In 2015, they signed with the label Integrity Music and sort of started fresh with a new debut album called Brother, consisting mostly of re-recorded or remixed or reproduced songs from their past releases, as well as a few new ones. I reviewed that album at the time, pretty early on in the days of this channel. I'll put a link to that video in the description box below and in the little button in the top corner of the screen, my left, your right. Since signing with their label, they have also dropped a short 4-track EP called See the Love early last year. And this was an EP where I think the Brilliance really started to transition into who they currently are. Leaning more towards social justice and cultural issues and away from strictly liturgical and church-oriented songs. The heart of the Brilliance has always been for compassion and community, the love of all people, and that continued on. But actually, since the release of Brother, the band has been shaping some of their lyrics to distinctly relate to the current, at least at the time of the release, cultural and social discussions that are going on. If there are issues that matter to the Brilliance that are showing up in our newspaper headlines or social media feeds, they were starting to weave those issues into their lyrics. And on this EP, See the Love, they did this even more, almost in every corner of the EP. Lyric after lyric was crafted in the present, undeniably pointing to the culture we, primarily in America, exist in right now, and daringly even becoming political at times. The themes and the subjects of these songs were familiar to us, and the Brilliance didn't beat around the bush when it came to discussing these issues, things they saw as most problematic in our society. Racial inequality, historical systems and structures of oppression, gun control, immigration law, firestorm-type issues, hot-button issues, and issues that the Brilliance was and still is passionate about. So at the release, as the release date of this new album approached, coming on the heels of 2016, a year where these social issues I just mentioned grew and grew in intensity throughout the year, I wondered just how upfront, or some may say in your face, the lyrics would be on this album. I saw how politically charged their last EP was at times, speaking with more than just moral language, but actually politically leaning language. Sometimes they seemed to even equate the policies or the beliefs they were standing up for with love, as if to indicate these policies and love for your neighbor go hand in hand, and they're maybe inseparable. If you separate the policies, or if you separate from the policies, you're separating from true love, in a sense, which, as you might imagine, can be pretty politically divisive. So I was curious, almost worried and anxious about where this album was headed. If this album came across as shouting at you or drawing political lines in the sand, people would be frustrated. Conversation would be shut down, and this band, who I have genuinely liked, would probably suffer in the long run. Well, this new album, All Is Not Lost, which came out a little over a week ago, and I am pleased to say it did not live up to my fears. I want to talk about, more than just the politics, but quickly, I think this album was very careful and precise in what issues it brought up and how it spoke about social and cultural problems, and its overall intent, which is undoubtedly aimed at unity and empathy for one another, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on. In the lead up to this album, the Brilliance released 6 episodes of a podcast that dove deeper into the inspirations behind some of these songs, the message behind the message, if you will. And if you want to dig into that, I'll put a link to it in the description box below this video. It's much more upfront and direct about what these songs mean and stand for rather than, in the songs themselves, which I think was a smart move, softening the articulation on the album, but sharpening it on this podcast. I certainly don't agree with them on everything. Actually, we probably disagree more often than we agree, but I'm glad that they left those deep dives for the podcast rather than on the album. So there's a lot I could unpack on the theology and the worldview of this album, but I can't get to all of it in this concise video. So these guys unpacked their thoughts on a podcast, and that's practically what I would need as well in order to do the same. So let's just jump right in. Let's talk about the music first. I think this album suffered from trying to be something that the Brilliance never really has been before. And more so than that, it far too often obscured the styles that have so defined this band through the years. One of the reasons I have been so continuously impressed with these guys is their ability to get you wrapped up in the emotion and the drama of the music, so much so that you basically forget where you are. Your mind drifts away, you blankly stare, and the swelling, passionate, often classically inspired music transports you to another place mentally. In the past, their music has been powerfully engaging, not because it's hectic or chaotic, but quite the opposite. It's so deeply emotional and intimately human and relatable. You can't help but sit and feel very quiet and moved. And there were a few songs on this album that were like this, such as the opening track, "O Earth," which is almost a preface to the album. It opens with the sound of these otherworldly radio waves, as if the message to follow, like the album to follow, is being beamed in from an outsider. It's a message to Earth from someone beyond Earth. The strings in this song are delicate and small, but comforting and hopeful. And the background vocals sound like they have this pitched up effect, further emphasizing this message beyond our world. The redone version of "See the Love" is also beautifully done. That's a track that was originally on their most recent EP. This version is much more in the vein of the typical sound from the Brilliance, especially when you think about the surrounding tracks on this album. The piano here is the lead instrument from front to back, and the other instruments and backing vocals are just decoration. Magnificent decoration to be sure. But the piano performance is the core, and it's this simple sound, this classically inspired sound that I think lets John Arndt's eye-popping skill shine so brightly. As he's shown through their past discography, he's a brilliant, no pun intended, composer and producer, and he has an uncommon talent for this sound, at least, within the music circles where the Brilliance is known. But beyond these few tracks and some individual moments throughout the album, like the sweeping end of the track "Hear Our Prayer," the rest of this album seemed to be too eager to layer in more instruments until the track was too heavy, or get a drum groove going in a place where it's just not needed, or utilize synth tones in place of acoustic pianos and strings. They weren't necessarily creating sounds that were unpalatable or unsavory, but on an album from the Brilliance with the talented John Arndt at the helm, it felt like these musical decisions led to smothering the production rather than allowing it to flourish. There were numerous times where the strings and the piano were doing wonderful things worth being held out prominently in the mix, but they were buried by bass and drums. For instance, the second track, "Gravity of Love," the strings are bringing this deluge of emotion, but there's other instruments that sort of trample on them. This beefy synth bass, there's this electronic drum production, there's this big booming drum set complete with hefty tom fills. I understand how they may have been trying to translate the gravity in the lyrics in the title, but I just felt it was more detrimental and actually less weighty than they have been on previous records, where the songs have felt generally sparser and more introspective, but still managed to hit you harder than this track. The tracks Turning Over Tables and Hear Our Prayer are probably the most wayward tracks on the album, with synth parts and drum grooves that I never thought I would hear from this group. These tracks sounded more like something you would hear from Matt Carney, or possibly even a tamer side of Owl City. Instead of taking the passionate, heartfelt lyrics in these songs and putting them on a pedestal, the bombastic instrumentals basically stole the attention. There's so much going on, and at such little value when you think of the musical richness of this band's music in the past. I do have to quickly mention the music on the track Who is Jesus, which I actually really liked. It was varied, it was intriguing, had this incredible ending where they really started to sound like Radiohead, which was surprising, but worked really well. And there was this active, sort of digitized bass. There was a noisy drum set, sort of all that combined with these cascading and swirling strings. It was a really cool sound I think they pulled off tastefully. So musically, for the most part, I wasn't really feeling this album. I enjoyed some parts, some entire songs, but on the whole, I would say this is inferior to most of their other releases, which have almost all been total knockouts. I mean, so yeah, I guess they're suffering here from having continually set the bar so high in the past. Lyrically, I don't think there's a whole lot to write home about on this album. I mean, in terms of just compelling and powerful lyricism, it's nothing compared to some of their past songs like Brother, Does Your Heart Break, or Make Us One. I mean, there are some poetic moments, some good uses of symbolism and metaphor in this album, like the celestial type pictures in the first few tracks, or in the last track where the scattering of seeds of peace bring forth trees that give lasting rest. But probably the best this album offers is in the track Turning Over Tables, toward the end of the chorus with the lines, turning over tables, tearing down walls, building up bridges between us all. Very unifying, connectivity emphasizing lines. And I loved how they flipped the tables, even of the verbiage, as they say building up, which is generally followed by the word walls. But they follow it with bridges, which I know you don't really build up bridges, but still, in the same way that the message of the song is to flip the script, if you will. They flipped a common phrase, which I thought was really clever and very memorable. But for the most part, the lyrics in this album were too lofty, idealistic, and intangible to be deeply affecting. Sometimes this comes in broadly generic lines about God's love in sort of non-specific and CCM-friendly phrases. Other times it's in sentimental, sappy visions of love and utopia, a hopefulness in this that in this life I feel is beyond possibility. Until Christ comes back and ushers in the new heavens and the new earth, the idea that hateful mindsets or violence or fear and all related woes will cease is a fool's errand. Now, I still find inspiration from voices like the Brilliance who carry forward this unwavering hopefulness, but it can get so overly romantic in its dreams for a bright future that I start to roll my eyes more than feeling empowered. All right, let's close this thing up here. There's a lot that I have to leave unsaid because I'm not going to turn this into a 30-minute video. But in summary, I was kind of disappointed by this album. The musicality wasn't even comparable to the richness that can be savored from even their very first album. And I was disappointed that the lyrics were more hot air than captivating substance. Also, the message of the gospel in its necessary centrality in bringing about restoration was basically non-existent. For a band that has been so outwardly theological in the past, it was odd to see that take such a backseat to social, cultural, and community-focused lyrics. And as the songs talked about, love and unity and hopefulness, it was disappointing that that was not rooted in Christ, the one mediator between God and man, as it says in 1 Timothy. But I am still thankful that the Brilliance continues to carry forward the attitude of 2 Corinthians 6, where it says sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. Throughout their discography and even on this album, they have balanced, honest articulations of devastating realities of this world and their brokenness for people who are hurting or suffering. They've balanced these lows with the highs of hopefulness that God has not forsaken us, that He has not left us without hope. But I think the point where the Brilliance and I start to differ is in how that restoration is brought about, or where the role of the gospel plays, the message of Christ's death and resurrection for sinners. Because when an album attempts to provide a message of hope, but the gospel is barely articulated, how can it help people with anything more than temporal restoration? The world's greatest need, my greatest need, your greatest need, our eternal need is to be reconciled to God. And thanks be to God that He does so through His Son. There are links down below this video for you to hear this album for yourself and to check out the lyrics if you're interested. There's also a link to the Brilliance's Twitter so you can connect with them, see what they're up to. And with that, thank you for watching this album review. If you enjoyed this video, if you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe to the channel. New album reviews just like this release every Monday. Subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss any new reviews. If you have a question or a comment for me about this album, about my thoughts about this album, or about something else, you can comment below this video. You could tweet at me at discernreviews, or you could send me an email, discernreviews@gmail.com. Have you listened to this album from The Brilliance? What do you think about it, especially in comparison to their past releases? Do you like the direction they went in or not? Whatever you're thinking, positive or negative, let me know. Thanks again for being here. Hope this helps. See you next week.